Bronn sat upon the Iron Throne for the first time with a mixture of disbelief and delight flickering behind his cool hazel eyes. The throne room stretched out before him like a gilded cage, its pillars soaring toward a vaulted ceiling where long-dead kings glared down from carved stone faces. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating motes of dust that shimmered in the stale air. The hush that settled over the hall was so thick it felt like the very stones were holding their breath, waiting to see if the black-haired Sellsword-turned-lord-turned-king would prove equal to the burden of ruling the Seven Kingdoms. They had crowned him with the barbed gold circlet only moments ago. It still felt strange against his scalp, heavier than he ever would have guessed. Bronn had never craved crowns. He craved gold and comfort and the freedom to enjoy them. But here he was, perched on that monstrous seat forged from 1,000 melted blades. Each protrusion and twist of metal gleamed menacingly, reminding him, should he ever forget, that this seat had been built by fire and war. None of this was supposed to happen, and yet, as he sat there, he could almost taste the sweet tang of power on his tongue. The lords and ladies in attendance had been handpicked, or so it seemed to Bronn, from every corner of the realm. Some wore their anxiousness openly, while others struggled to keep their expressions neutral. Lords from the Reach, the Westerlands, the North, and the Vale stood in rigid lines of silk and steel, uncertain whether this new king was their best hope or their worst nightmare. Across the throne room, the hush was finally broken by the shuffle of boots on stone, the crackle of a distant torch, the nervous clearing of throats. A few whispered remarks about the new king's rough beginnings floated on the edges of hearing. Bronn's journey to this throne had been a dance through chaos. The wars that had raged across Westeros in recent years destroyed entire families, upended the greatest houses, and left the realm so exhausted that even a low-born Sellsword might find opportunity in the rubble. The rightful heirs were either dead or exiled, and alliances had shattered so many times that no one seemed to know who to turn to. The lords paramount, once proud and unyielding, found themselves desperately searching for stability. They remembered how Bronn had survived through cunning and luck, forging new titles and incomes for himself from every shattered alliance, until one day, he stood with as legitimate a claim as any, Lord Paramount of the Reach by royal decree, Warden of the South, and favored by a desperate small council. When the dust finally settled, who was left to take the crown but the man who had outlived and outmaneuvered everyone else? He raised a single ring-bedecked hand, newly acquired in the spoils of his short reign. The hush grew deeper. His first words as king needed to be measured, but Bronn had never been a man of flowery speeches. Nor did he think the realm wanted to hear another swirling tapestry of noble rhetoric. So he spoke plainly, in that laconic style he had mastered over a lifetime of bargaining and battlefields. "Right?" he said, leaning forward, the metal edges of the throne pressing uncomfortably through his breeches. "We've all spent enough time kneeling and enough time bickering. Let's get on with the business of running the realm." Some of the lords exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected a formal coronation speech, perhaps an address that evoked the grandeur of Targaryen dragons and the honor of the Stark kings. But Bronn was not that type of king. He had never believed in pomp for the sake of pomp. He believed in coin, results, and ensuring his own hide stayed intact. That morning set the tone for the days that followed. After the coronation feast, which was good enough, though Bronn made sure the kitchen spared no expense with wine, roast boar, and spiced honey cakes, he withdrew to the council chambers to speak with his advisors. No matter that he was king, he still needed people who could read and think strategically about matters beyond gold, wine, and women. He had a handful of them. A one-handed maester with a talent for logistics, a lady from the Vale famed for her ability to broker treaties, a knight of the Kingsguard who once served a rival king but had proven to be more loyal to the kingdom than any cause. At their side was a young scribe who tracked every coin spent by the crown, every shipment of grain, and every soldier who returned or never returned from war. Bronn presided over them like a Sellsword captain at a war council. He lounged in his seat, swirling a cup of arbor red, listening carefully to what each person had to say. When the maester described the realm's debts, seemingly endless, Bronn let out a long, slow sigh and ran his tongue over his teeth. When the Vale lady outlined potential trade pacts with Essos, Bronn offered a curt nod, thinking of how he might line the royal coffers in a hurry. When talk came to the rebellious lords in the north, who refused to recognize his claim, he let out a bark of laughter. "Well, they'll come around or they won't, but we'll see to them all the same," he said, eyes gleaming with that particular mixture of mirth and danger that had unsettled many in his day. He remembered how, as a simple sellsword, he had scaled the Eyrie with Tyrion Lannister's gold in mind, or how he'd outdueled a knight who thought honor was a shield stronger than cunning. He had always been too pragmatic to mistake illusions for reality. The illusions of rightful rulership and the reality of power could not have been clearer to him now, perched on the Iron Throne. The days grew into weeks. Ravens were sent out to every corner of the kingdom proclaiming the new king's ascension. Some ravens returned promptly with polite but wary acknowledgments. Others did not return at all. The tensions that lingered from the War of the Five Kings were not resolved with a simple coronation. If anything, the realm was raw and suspicious, like an old wound that refused to heal. Bronn wasn't naive enough to think it would be easy. In some ways, that was freeing. He had no illusions about upholding the ideals of chivalry or reuniting the realm out of some grand sense of duty. He simply wanted order, coin, and the possibility of peace, if only because chaos would threaten his newly acquired wealth and comfort. The Red Keep had changed since the war. Towers once battered by dragonfire had been partially rebuilt, the scorched stones still visible in certain sections of wall. Bronn made it his personal crusade to oversee the repairs, half to ensure the fortress was secure, half to keep an eye on the gold being spent. He had heard too many tales of coin slipping through the cracks when unscrupulous stewards or treasurers saw an opportunity. That would not do under his watch, not when he was the one paying for it. The Red Keep's labyrinth of secret passages, rumored to have been built by Maegor the Cruel, also intrigued him. He had men searching those passageways, mapping them out as best they could, so that Bronn would never be caught unawares by an assassin or a spy creeping through hidden doors. In the throne room, each passing day brought a new line of petitioners. They filed in at dawn from all stations in life. A fisherman from the Stormlands who claimed a lord seized his boat. A mother from Flea Bottom who begged the king to release her son from the City Watch's dungeons. A minor lord from the Westerlands squabbling with his neighbor over a piece of land. Bronn heard them all with an ear that was equal parts dismissive and practical. He had no patience for long-winded speeches. He'd wave a hand and demand an explanation in fewer words. Then he'd make a ruling. Sometimes he was lenient, sometimes harsh. Often, he demanded a fee if a noble's request seemed too trivial. "Pay the crown for wasting the crown's time," he would say, half joking, though the gold that came in was no joke at all. Some lords spluttered, others grudgingly paid. He took each coin with a lazy grin that never quite hid the sharp intelligence in his eyes. That same intelligence guided him when it came to forging alliances he needed. The Tyrells were all but gone, but the great houses of the Reach still held significant power. Bronn knew it would be unwise to alienate them entirely, so he dangled them small gifts. A tax break here, a favorable position in the new administration there. Yet he never gave so much that they could grow too confident. Meanwhile, the Westerlands still boasted considerable gold in their mines, though those mines were rumored to be running dry. He courted them carefully, hoping to secure a consistent revenue stream from a region he had once served as a sellsword. In the Vale, the Lady Regent looked upon his rule with guarded interest, while the North rumbled their discontent. It was always the North, Bronn thought. Too cold for comfort, too stubborn for politics. Yet he didn't want to march an army up there. War was expensive, and if he knew anything, it was to weigh every risk against the potential reward. People across King's Landing gossiped about their new monarch. Some said he was no better than a bandit who happened to sit on a throne. Others whispered that he might finally bring the kind of pragmatic leadership the realm needed, after so many years of reckless ambition by noble houses. Most small folk cared little for who wore the crown, as long as they could eat and keep their families safe. If Bronn could achieve that, then in time they would accept him, perhaps even cheer for him. So he placed a sharp emphasis on security. The City Watch was expanded, better trained, and paid a fair wage. He installed men he trusted to command them, men who understood that loyalty to the king was paramount and that corruption would be met with swift punishment. If the people saw the gold cloaks as a force of order rather than oppressive bullies, it would make life easier for everyone. While the capital watched with uneasy curiosity, far to the north, tensions crackled like ice splitting in a frozen river. Lords in Winterfell had grown accustomed to various southern kings making their claims. Some of them remembered their short-lived independence. They had bled in the wars that ravaged the continent, losing brothers, sons, and daughters. Why bend the knee to a sellsword who once fought for whomever offered the highest price? Word came through ravens that the current head of House Stark, young, untested but proud, kept a frosty silence whenever the new king's name was mentioned. The bannermen of the north bristled. They spoke of their ancestors who once ruled themselves. Some demanded a return to the days of the kings in the north. Bronn's approach to the north was not one of immediate aggression. Instead, he proposed trade, offering them favorable terms for southern goods, wine, spices, cloth, for northern furs and timber. When the first shipments arrived without sabotage, it looked promising. Yet no open declaration of fealty came. And so, every day, Bronn found himself juggling that knotty problem with a mixture of annoyance and grudging admiration. He had always respected those who could stand on their own feet. But respect or not, he was king now, and every corner of the realm must at least acknowledge his rule. He tossed the question around with his council in late-night meetings lit by guttering candles. They debated the cost of a military campaign up north, the timeline for forging a marriage alliance, the possibility of some concession that might appease the proud northerners. Bronn drank copious amounts of wine during these debates, swirling the ruby liquid in his cup, and sometimes offering a wry grin at the more grandiose proposals. Finally, he shrugged. For now, let them be. If they want to break away, they'll have to do more than glare at the cold. We can revisit them later. The council seemed relieved that they wouldn't be marching an army into the frozen wastelands just yet. Over the following months, Bronn took a series of steps that, in many ways, redefined how the crown interacted with the realm. He restructured the way taxes were collected, reducing some levies that weighed heavily on the peasantry, while imposing steeper duties on the import of luxury goods, a move that irritated many wealthy merchants but won him the tacit approval of small folk in the crownlands. He poured coin into rebuilding farmland ravaged by war, knowing that an empty granary was as dangerous to a king as an invading army. He made deals with captains from Bravos, Pentos, and other free cities to bring in tradesmen and open new markets, trying to make the ports along Blackwater Bay come alive with commerce again. And he did it all with a cutthroat sense of cost and benefit. If it didn't fill the coffers or keep the peace, it wasn't worth it. His approach to justice in King's Landing became something of a legend, one that spread through whispers and bawdy songs alike. If a lord stood accused of fraud or worse, Bronn seemed to delight in cutting through the pomp that would usually protect them. He might summon the person to the throne room, let them talk for a while, and then ask a few blunt questions that exposed every half-truth or contradiction. A sellsword's instincts were good for sniffing out lies. Often, he dismissed the lord's protests and threw them in a dungeon. Other times, if the matter was slight, he imposed a hefty fine. Either way, nobles quickly learned that the man on the Iron Throne was not so easily swayed by old feudal loyalties. To the small folk, that was a refreshing change. But the realm was large, and not all corners welcomed his brand of justice. In the Riverlands, resentments festered. The region had been torn apart by the War of the Five Kings and still reeled from lawlessness. Bands of outlaws roamed, robbing merchants and farmers. The new king had few spare soldiers to send, so the lords of the Trident felt abandoned. Letters arrived at the Red Keep, begging for men to root out the brigands. Bronn understood the threat that roving bandits posed to the stability he was trying to build. But sending armies was expensive. He ordered that bounties be placed on the heads of known outlaw leaders, enough gold to tempt lesser criminals into turning on their chiefs. That was how Bronn might have handled it back in his sellsword days. It was cheaper than fielding an army, and, he reasoned, it might be more effective. Time would tell if this tactic succeeded. Meanwhile, across the sea in Essos, merchants and would-be adventurers took note of the new king's appetite for trade. More ships arrived in King's Landing, bringing exotic goods, new fashions, and fresh opportunities for cunning men to make fortunes. The city's population swelled. With more people came more complications. Crime rose in certain districts, and new rivalries took root between established guilds and foreign newcomers. Bronn found himself forced to navigate these tensions carefully, balancing the desire for a thriving port city with the need to keep the old guard from undermining his rule. All the while, the king's personal life invited rumors. Of course, there were ladies at court who vied for his attention, each hoping she might become the new queen. Yet Bronn did not seem keen to marry. He had never harbored illusions of romantic love, nor did he want to tie himself to a single family if a more beneficial alliance might appear tomorrow. He entertained a few fleeting dalliances, but made no formal betrothal. This alarmed some of his advisors who urged him to secure the line of succession. "You need an heir, Your Grace," one of them insisted. Bronn only shrugged. "Heirs cause trouble, I hear. Let's not rush that." Within the Red Keep, talk of potential plots grew. There were old Targaryen loyalists still lurking in the shadows, perhaps plotting to put another dragon claimant on the throne. The Lannisters had not entirely disappeared, some said, and maybe they conspired to retake the seat of power. Others whispered of the Dornish, who had a talent for waiting, biding their time, and striking when least expected. Bronn ordered the Master of Whispers, an appointment he had given to a clever ex-mercenary who had served under various banners, to keep close watch on these rumors. He remembered all too well how quickly the winds could shift in Westeros. He had no intention of being toppled by the same game he had once played so well. As the seasons turned, the king began traveling more frequently to the neighborhoods and markets of King's Landing, escorted by a sizable retinue of gold cloaks. He wanted a sense of the city beyond what courtiers told him. He stopped at taverns in the city, occasionally shocking the barkeepers by raising a tankard with them. He listened to the butchers and fishmongers complain about new taxes or praise new opportunities. He made judgments on the spot sometimes, telling the city watch captain to send men to some alley that had become notorious for robberies. Word spread that the king walked among them. This curbed some of the brazen crimes in broad daylight, though it also made the city watchful. No one wanted to be the fool who caused a scene in front of the king. Further beyond the capital, smaller lords still grumbled over the dissolution of their old privileges. Bronn had curbed the right of certain lords to raise private tolls on roads, believing it stifled trade. He demanded all new roads be toll-free by royal decree, trusting the realm-wide economic benefits would outstrip the immediate losses. This caused friction among the lords who relied heavily on these tolls for income. In their eyes, the king was meddling in their ancient rights. In Bronn's eyes, those rights did nothing but enrich petty tyrants and hamper commerce. The friction threatened to spark rebellions in a few pockets, but the king's network of informants was adept at ferreting out trouble before it boiled over. When conspiracies were uncovered, Bronn acted decisively. The ringleaders found themselves brought to King's Landing in chains. Some were executed, others banished, and a few were forced to pay staggering fines to the crown. The message was clear: challenge the king's reforms at your peril. Despite such strong-arm tactics, the realm as a whole began to stabilize. Crops flourished in well-irrigated lands. Merchants made coin in the ports. The roads were safer than they had been in years. In many respects, Bronn's rule began to feel like a golden age to the small folk, or at least a respite from the endless wars. Sure, they still had to pay taxes, but they were no longer as arbitrary as before. Sure, bandits still harassed travelers, but not in the same organized scale that once plagued the countryside. Step by step, Bronn earned a grudging respect, even from those who sneered at his low-born origins. One evening, several months after his coronation, Bronn convened a banquet in the Great Hall of the Red Keep. Invitations had gone out to notable lords, ladies, knights, merchants, and other influential figures from across Westeros. They dined on succulent roast swan, spiced turnips, honeyed fruits, and drank flagons of wine from the arbor. By the time the musicians finished their fourth set, The crowd was comfortably intoxicated and lulled into something akin to unity. Laughter rang out across the hall, and every so often, Bronn would stand and say something irreverent that made the entire room roar with laughter or gasp at his audacity. It was there that ambassadors from Dorne approached him. They spoke politely, praising the king's achievements, hinting at potential alliances between the Southron Kingdom and the Crown. Dorne had always marched to the beat of its own drum, resistant to subjugation and proud of its Martell heritage. Still, it was clear they recognized the utility of forging a workable relationship with this pragmatic new king. They presented him with exotic gifts, parchment from the Summer Islands, casks of fine Dornish wine, and a personal invitation to visit Sunspear. Bronn studied the ambassadors carefully, noting their fine attire and guarded smiles. He raised a cup in thanks, but inwardly he weighed their potential motives. Perhaps they simply wanted to ensure Dorne could maintain its relative autonomy. Or perhaps they had more cunning aims. Either way, he told them, "I look forward to the day when I can sample your son and your wines in person." As the banquet wore on, a bard took to singing a recently composed ballad, The Sellsword King. The tune was catchy, a mix of admiration and wry humor. It told the story of a poor sellsword who climbed the ranks from bodyguard to lord to king, always chasing coin, winning duels, and outsmarting highborn rivals. The chorus repeated how he'd bought, bartered, and battled his way to the throne. Some lords found it distasteful, considering it an insult to the dignity of the monarchy. Bronn, on the other hand, laughed at the refrain, tapped his foot, and tipped the bard a few gold dragons when the performance ended. "At least it's honest," he quipped, causing a renewed ripple of amusement among those assembled. That same night, a curious visitor approached the king while he relaxed in a side chamber. The man wore robes of midnight blue, his features hidden in deep shadow. He spoke softly, calling himself only a humble servant of knowledge. At first, Bronn's guard bristled, but the visitor raised his hands calmly, offering no threat. In a low voice, he claimed to have information about a secret Targaryen heir rumored to be hiding in Essos. He offered the knowledge for a price, naturally. Bronn's eyes narrowed. He asked a few probing questions, but the visitor was evasive. He demanded a large sum of gold to reveal more. Bronn, unimpressed, signaled to his men to remove the man from the keep. But he couldn't entirely shake the whisper that perhaps there was still a dragon claimant out there. So he ordered his master of whispers to investigate further. His sellsword instincts told him not to dismiss any threat outright, no matter how outlandish. Word of Bronn's overtures to foreign trade also reached the Iron Islands. There, a recently ascendant lord reigned who eyed the mainland with the typical contempt of the Ironborn. They considered themselves raiders, not traders, though the wealth pouring into King's Landing did pique some Ironborn interest. Could plunder be had from these new merchant fleets? In response to rumors of possible raids, Bronn boosted the crown's naval presence, stationing war galleys at key points along the coast. The lords in the Iron Islands might hate him, but they would understand the might of a well-funded royal navy. He wasn't about to see his blossoming trade lanes ruined by reavers. A few swift, brutal sea battles in the waters off the Westerlands convinced the raiders that King Bronn's ships were not easy targets. Though skirmishes continued sporadically, they never evolved into full-scale war. All these balancing acts, courting alliances, suppressing potential revolts, spurring commerce, formed the tapestry of Bronn's reign. He had never asked for such complexity when he was a simple cutthroat. Back then, life had been straightforward. Kill if you must, flee if you must, follow gold when you can. Now, every choice had consequences that rippled across a continent. And ironically, he found himself enjoying the challenge. Perhaps it was the thrill of playing the most dangerous game of all. The Game of Thrones, but with the deck stacked in his favor for once. Privately, in moments of reflection, Bronn sometimes recalled the days he spent at the Eyrie, at the side of the imp, Tyrion Lannister, before that name became as mired in blood and politics as any. He remembered Tyrion's jokes about how everyone was always scheming over chairs. And now here he was, sitting on the damned spikiest chair of all. He wondered what Tyrion would think of this turn of events. Would he laugh or shake his head in disbelief? Perhaps both. The realm had a way of surprising even the most jaded cynics. In time, news drifted south from the north. Winterfell had seen a shift in leadership. The young Stark who had refused to bend the knee vanished under mysterious circumstances, and the bannermen scrambled to determine a new path forward. A delegation from the north finally arrived in King's Landing to sue for something akin to independence. They wanted to style themselves protectors of the north, in deference to the king, but with broad autonomy. It was an old dance, repeated time and again throughout history. Bronn received them in the throne room, acknowledging the starkness of their attire, wolf sigils pinned to rough-spun cloaks, and their proud posture. They made their case with the typical northern straightforwardness. Bronn listened, rolling a small gold coin between his fingers out of habit. His answer surprised many. Rather than dismiss the idea outright, he toyed with it, playing each side's interest against the other. He told them that as long as the taxes from the north came to the crown, and they did not raise an army to challenge him, he would grant them a degree of self-governance. Some of his council balked. Concessions to the north could encourage other regions to demand the same. But Bronn saw it differently. The north is too big, too poor, and too stubborn. Let them have some illusions of freedom. We still get the gold, and no one marches south to break our gates. The northern delegation was caught off guard by the relative ease of the negotiation. They left King's Landing with a cautious optimism. Bronn expected that over time, he could whittle away at their autonomy if needed. Or, if they became too troublesome, he could cross that bridge later. For now, he was content to keep the realm from splintering into yet another war. In the midst of all this, Bronn's personal relationships evolved. He had come to rely heavily on a select few counselors. Foremost among them was his master of coin, a reformed hedge knight with a knack for numbers, who constantly pored over ledgers and devised new ways to fill the coffers. Another was the Lady of the Vale, who served as his master of laws, cunning and quick-witted, every bit his equal in banter. The Kingsguard, once an exalted body of legendary knights, had been reduced in the wars, but Bronn handpicked a few stalwarts, men who had proven their loyalty not by birth, but by deeds. Among them was a broad-shouldered knight from the Stormlands who had wrestled a wildling to death in single combat, and an older swordmaster from the Reach known for his unerring sense of justice. Bronn insisted that each Kingsguard member also be given a fair stipend. Loyalty, in his view, was best sustained by ensuring a man was well-fed and well-rewarded, not just cloaked in white out of some old notion of honor. Despite his successes, the realm remained rife with old grudges. The scars of the previous wars ran deep. House Tully was diminished, but not powerless. House Greyjoy was restless. House Arryn in the Vale had a child lord who might come of age soon, complicating their loyalty to the crown. The Westerlands were led by a Lannister cousin who was neither brilliant nor incompetent, but cautious, holding on to what remained of their house's pride and wealth. The Stormlands had accepted Bronn's rule with a shrug. They had too many storms and too few resources to challenge him outright. But that acceptance was a fragile thing. And in Dorne, the Martells or their cousins might see a path to greater influence now that a king without strong familial alliances sat the throne. Amid these chess pieces, Bronn remained wary. He made a show of living well feasts, hunts in the Kingswood, the occasional jousting tournament to appease the knights who loved such displays. But behind the scenes, he maneuvered. He made sure gold found its way into the pockets of those who mattered. He offered small gestures of favor to lords who showed him loyalty, ensuring their minor successes wouldn't threaten the crown's power. Conversely, when a small lord or lady stepped out of line, he'd demonstrate the reach of his authority, seizing their lands or imposing steep taxes until they either fell in line or destroyed themselves in feudal rebellion. In one notable incident, a disgruntled lord from the Westerlands refused to pay the newly levied taxes, claiming them to be an affront to his ancient rights. He mustered a small force of men-at-arms and threatened to close off the roads through his domain. Bronn responded with a ruthlessly efficient tactic. He sent a fraction of the crown's forces, led by a hardened knight of the Kingsguard, to confront the rebellion. The rebel lord, expecting a grand campaign, was startled to find a small but elite unit descending on him swiftly. It was over in a matter of days. The rebels' banners were torn down, and he was carted back to King's Landing in chains. Bronn presided over his trial with cool disinterest, allowed the man to speak his piece, then sentenced him to forfeit half his lands and pay a heavy tribute for the crown's trouble. The display served its purpose. Others took note. Still, there were kinder stories to be told of King Bronn. When a series of storms ravaged the coast of the Reach, destroying fishing villages, he dispatched royal ships loaded with grain and supplies, largely because he knew hungry and desperate people tended to rebel, but also perhaps because some vestige of rough sympathy lingered in him for common folk. When an orphanage in Flea Bottom caught fire, he funded its rebuilding out of his personal coffers, insisting it was the sort of good deed that might buy him some favor with the gods. Jesters and cynics alike whispered that Bronn was no pious man, but perhaps playing at virtue sometimes suited him. Time passed in this fashion, balancing acts, negotiations, expansions, and the occasional show of force. King's Landing itself took on a new energy under this reign. Brothels and taverns flourished. Bronn had no wish to stifle vice, as it was a profitable endeavor and kept the people entertained. The arts began to bloom again, too, as traveling players and minstrels found that an audience with coin in their pockets was eager for distraction. Mummer's troops staged comedic plays featuring sly references to the Sellsword King and his improbable rise. Street vendors sold trinkets shaped like a hand gripping a coin, a mocking emblem of the new monarchy. Bronn pretended not to care about the mockery, but he secretly enjoyed that they were making money off his legend, and that in its own way it popularized his image. One quiet morning, Bronn visited the castle stables, accompanied only by a couple of guards. The stable hands rushed to fetch his favorite horse, a tall black destrier with a temper. The king stroked its muzzle thoughtfully, remembering the days when he rode a borrowed horse or simply stole one if he needed it. Now he had his pick of the finest mounts in the realm. He found the old bridle the horse had been given, noticing it was worn. He told the stable hand to replace it with something better. The stable hand bowed, stammering his thanks. It was a small thing, but it reminded Bronn of how far he had come, and how quickly fortunes could change. He rode out into the city streets, letting the common folk see him. Some bowed clumsily, others simply gawked. He caught snippets of their talk. They were worried about winter supplies, or hopeful for new jobs in the expanding docks, or frightened of rumors that some shadowy band of rebels was forming in the Crownlands. It was always something. Sometimes, listening to their concerns, he wondered if the Iron Throne was worth all this fuss. Then again, no one would attempt to cheat or cross him if he still wandered as a lowly sellsword. Now, the entire realm had to pause and consider his reaction before they stepped out of line. Upon returning to the Red Keep, he convened his council. They discussed the logistics of a grand tour of Westeros to strengthen the king's presence in each region. The Master of Coin pointed out the expense, but Bronn saw the political gain. Appearances mattered. If he showed up in person, handing out boons, resolving disputes, people might be less likely to see him as an outsider. They drafted an itinerary. The tour would start in the Reach, where he held his own seat, move through the Stormlands, then up to the Vale, the Riverlands, and finally the Westerlands. Dorne and the North were left for last or perhaps omitted for a future journey, as each posed unique diplomatic challenges. Preparations began at once. Word spread quickly that the king was going on progress. Carpenters and masons in each city prepared to welcome him with newly erected arches or stages for public audiences. Bards composed songs praising his wise rule, hoping to curry favor. Local lords scrambled to tidy up their lands lest the king see something amiss and come down on them like a hammer. The Master of Coin arranged for a substantial traveling retinue. Knights for protection, officials to record local grievances, a traveling kitchen staff, plenty of wagons for tents and royal gifts. Bronn insisted they keep it as light as possible, mindful of the cost, but even a light royal progress required a small army of attendants. The first stop was Highgarden, which Bronn had claimed along with the title Lord Paramount of the Reach. The seat of the now nearly extinct Tyrell line was a wonder of lush gardens and opulent towers. When Bronn arrived, The gatehouse was festooned with gold and green banners, the Tyrell colors, not his personal sigil, which was a point of tension among the Reach lords who still remembered their lost family. They received him with measured courtesy. A banquet was thrown in his honor, complete with floral decorations that dwarfed anything King's Landing had mustered. Amidst the feasting, Bronn cast a wary eye at the assembled Reach lords, gleaning which ones might be loyal and which might harbor grudges. Afterward, he walked through the fabled gardens that gave the castle its name. He couldn't help but be impressed by the variety of flowers, the scented breezes, the carefully sculpted hedges. But he also recognized the quiet tension in every corner. The Reach had always been wealthy, proud, and used to leading itself. Now it was under the dominion of a king who rose from nothing. Old resentments died hard. Still, Bronn made an effort. He allowed one of the local ladies, known for her grace and wit, to guide him through the rose mazes. She tried to flatter him, praising his cunning. He took it with a half-smile, neither encouraging nor dismissing her. He left Highgarden after a week, dispensing gifts and pardons where it suited him, and forging a few alliances that might bear fruit later. Next came the Stormlands. The castle of Storm's End loomed on the horizon as the king's party approached. The ancient seat of House Baratheon was battered by gales off Shipbreaker Bay, yet it stood defiant as ever. The local lords greeted Bronn with less pomp than in the Reach, but their sincerity seemed greater. The storms left them little time for frippery. Over a hearty meal of seafood and strong ale, they pledged their continuing loyalty, provided he recognized their need for defense against Ironborn raids and savage storms. Bronn listened carefully, weighing their requests against what the crown could reasonably provide. He promised them timber from the king's forest reserves for shipbuilding, and in turn, they assured him of unwavering support. As a gesture, he joined the Stormlords in a boar hunt through windswept forests. A boar nearly gored one of the younger lords, and Bronn saved him with a well-timed thrust of a borrowed spear. The young man was impressed, vowing fealty anew to the king who fights like a Stormlander. Bronn enjoyed the flattery but remained watchful, aware that loyalty could blow away faster than storm clouds if fortunes changed. They traveled next to the Vale. The ascent to the Eyrie, if one dared, remained treacherous. Bronn smiled to recall how he'd once climbed that path under very different circumstances, trying to secure Tyrion's freedom. Now he returned as a king. The child lord of the Vale, overshadowed by his regents, greeted him with timid politeness. The Lady Regent, who had also served in his council, made sure he was warmly received. The Vale was peaceful, blessed with natural defenses, so Bronn only needed to confirm their willingness to contribute to the crown's coffers and armies when called. They held a small tournament in his honor. Knights from the Vale jousted, hawks soared in demonstrations of falconry, and the king observed it all with detached interest, awarding a purse of gold to the champion. In private, he discussed with the regent the possible betrothal of the child lord to some southern lady, forging stronger ties. For once, the king seemed to show interest in playing matchmaker for the sake of political gain. The Riverlands were next. Bronn braced himself for the region's wounds. Most of the major houses there had been devastated by the endless wars. Freys, Tullis, and others were shadows of their former selves, holding on to half-burnt castles or uneasy alliances. The king's presence in places like Harrenhal was particularly unsettling. Harrenhal loomed, a testament to curses and destruction, its massive towers melted long ago by dragonfire. The current holder of Harrenhal was a lesser lord who had gained the castle through complicated inheritance and bribes. Bronn shared a cup of ale with the man in the great hall, which still reeked of old ghosts. Rumors said the place was haunted. Bronn dismissed such talk, but noted the gloom. He offered the lord some strategic suggestions about using Harrenhal's vast, if mostly ruined, estates to bolster local agriculture. Whether the lord had the will or the resources to make it happen was anyone's guess. At Riverrun, he met with remnants of House Tully, who, though weakened, still held the castle. They told him of roving bandits that had grown bolder in recent weeks, ignoring the bounties. Bronn promised more immediate measures. dispatching a hardened company of crown soldiers to coordinate with local forces. With luck, that show of strength might stamp out the outlaws. Some small folk turned up to greet him, curious about this Sellsword king they had heard so much about. He surprised them by distributing sacks of grain in the castle courtyard. He also financed a new mill, seeing it as an investment that would eventually repay itself in taxes. The gesture won cheers and blessings, and if it also lined his coffers down the line, all the better. Finally, Bronn's entourage moved west, heading to the heart of the Westerlands. He knew this area well, having once served House Lannister. The path wound through gold-mining towns and wealthy estates. At Casterly Rock, the seat of the Lannisters, a prickly reception awaited. Though House Lannister's direct line was severely diminished, offshoots still clung to illusions of grandeur. The new caretaker of the Rock, a distant cousin of the old lord, seemed polite enough but carried the trademark Lannister pride. He hosted lavish feasts, hoping perhaps to impress or intimidate Bronn. Yet the king was not cowed by displays of opulence. He enjoyed the food and wine, bedded a willing lady-in-waiting one night, and kept his intentions hidden behind a friendly grin. In private meetings, he negotiated new mining charters, ensuring the crown would see a healthy cut of the gold still being pulled from the deep veins in the hills. Some whispered that the Lannister cousin resented a king who had once been a mere Sellsword in Lannister employ, but outwardly, he had little choice but to accept the new order. When the grand tour concluded, Bronn returned to King's Landing. He was exhausted from the long journey but satisfied with the results. Overall, he had spread goodwill, forged or renewed alliances, and shown that the crown's reach extended everywhere. The realm was gradually knitting itself back together, shaped by his brand of frank pragmatism. Where other kings might have tried to resurrect the glory of a bygone era, Bronn was content to build a realm that was stable, profitable, and unencumbered by pretensions. Let the bards sing their songs about the glories of the Targaryens or the honor of the Starks. He would rule in the here and now, counting coin as much as fealties. But no king can rest easy forever. As the final days of autumn approached, ravens brought unsettling news. A new group of rebels, styling themselves the True and Noble Hand, had emerged in the Crownlands. They preached that the realm needed a highborn ruler with ancient blood, not a lowborn cutthroat. Their ranks were small at first, comprised of discontented knights, second sons, and a few disillusioned peasants. But they spread pamphlets denouncing Bronn, calling him the Pretender King, and urging lords to remember their heritage. Worse still, rumors implied that they had allies in other regions, perhaps a Targaryen pretender, or exiled lords who saw a chance to return in glory. Bronn convened an emergency council meeting. The Master of Whispers confirmed the threat, though details were scarce. The rebel group was secretive, moving under cover of night, distributing leaflets and occasionally ambushing crown officials on the roads. Bronn could have dismissed it as another ragtag conspiracy, but something about their message, the call for true nobility, worried him. Westeros still had plenty of old families who would prefer a king with a storied lineage rather than a Sellsword's cunning. This was exactly the sort of sentiment that could grow if left unchecked. He ordered the Master of Whispers to infiltrate the group, to find their leaders. Simultaneously, he commanded the City Watch to crack down on any rebels operating in King's Landing. It was a difficult task. The group was slippery, and some of the king's own men might secretly sympathize with their cause. Still, gold had a way of loosening tongues, and slowly information trickled in. The rebels had an underground network that stretched from the Crownlands to the Reach and possibly to the Vale. They spoke of installing a hidden scion of House Baratheon or Targaryen. No one was quite sure which. Some even suggested a black-haired boy rumored to be the bastard of Robert Baratheon, smuggled away years ago. Whether such a boy existed or not was unclear. Tension in King's Landing rose palpably. Posters of the king were defaced in certain districts. A few gold cloaks turned up dead in alleyways. Bronn responded with severity. He stationed more guards at key points, imposed curfews in sensitive areas, and doubled the patrolling watch. He ordered that any confirmed member of this true and noble hand be imprisoned or hanged for treason, depending on the severity of their crimes. The city grew uneasy, whispering that the king was taking on a tyrannical edge. But Bronn believed it necessary. He would not let the realm descend into chaos because a few discontented fools preferred a highborn puppet. A year into the crackdown, the rebellion had not been extinguished but was losing momentum. Some leaders had been captured, tortured, and executed, revealing bits of a larger, fractured conspiracy. Others fled into the countryside. A portion of the small folk, who had once been ambivalent, now feared the harshness of the king's justice. But many more still valued the stability he had brought, especially as the harvest had been bountiful. They hesitated to throw it all away for some uncertain call to noble blood. And so, Bronn's hold remained firm, albeit not unchallenged. He took the opportunity to push forward more reforms, hoping to solidify his position. He encouraged the formation of local councils to handle minor disputes in towns and villages, supervised by crown-appointed reeves. It was a way to involve the populace in governance while ensuring ultimate loyalty to the throne. He expanded roads and built new inns, encouraging trade and travel. He also reorganized the crown's finances, using revenue from the ports and mines to pay off some of the massive debts incurred by previous rulers. His master of coin often marveled that a man once dismissed as a greedy sellsword had managed the kingdom's finances more effectively than many anointed kings before him. In these calmer moments, Bronn would stroll through the royal gardens, still not as grand as Highgardens, but lovely enough, and reflect on the ironies of fate. He'd think of the first time he saw King's Landing, the stench of it, the chaos, and how he now presided over it all from the Red Keep. Sometimes he'd recall old battles fought on the Blackwater, or the unlikely friendships he'd formed and lost. He was not a sentimental man, but the weight of the crown had a way of stoking reflections. He also became more cautious about his personal security. He had never been trusting, but now he made sure to sleep in different chambers on random nights, kept a cupbearer he trusted implicitly, and tested his food for poisons. The Master of Whispers assured him that assassins were always a threat, especially to a king with so many underestimating or resenting him. Bronn shrugged off the danger with bravado, but he never fully let his guard down. Another year passed, and the realm seemed more or less at peace, with pockets of dissent overshadowed by the benefits of improved trade and steady leadership. The king still had no queen or heir, a point of frequent gossip. Some factions believed he intentionally avoided fathering children to keep potential rivals from rallying around a royal child. Others whispered that he had fathered bastards in secret, perhaps distributing them among fosters in the countryside, just as other lords had done for centuries. The truth was likely simpler. He enjoyed the freedom of being unencumbered by marriage alliances that might demand more of him than he wished to give. Dorne remained a final frontier in his quest for stability. The Dornish ambassadors had grown more insistent about a visit. They hinted at a marriage arrangement, tying the Martell line to the crown. In return, Dorne would open up new trade routes, share advanced irrigation techniques, and perhaps offer soldiers if conflict flared again. It was an attractive proposition, but Bronn knew the Dornish rarely gave anything without a price. Marrying into their line would mean a certain measure of entanglement in their politics, and they played the Game of Thrones as skillfully as anyone. Still, as time wore on, he found himself considering it. A union with Dorne might bring lasting peace to the southern border and quell any lingering illusions of independence they might harbor. He also had to consider that an alliance with Dorne might strengthen his hand against other regions, especially if the true and noble hand ever rose again with a serious claimant. The idea nagged at him, lingering in the background of council sessions and solitary musings. The Master of Whispers argued for it, the Master of Coin saw potential profit, and the Lady from the Vale, his Master of Laws, expressed caution, reminding him how cunning Dornish politics could be. These deliberations crystallized when an official invitation arrived from Sunspear, detailing a lavish reception should the king accept their hospitality. There was talk of introducing him to a distant cousin of the Martells, a beautiful and intelligent woman of marriageable age, lauded for her knowledge of statecraft. Bronn cracked a grin when he read the letter. He could almost taste the Dornish wine that would flow in those red deserts, smell the spicy perfumes that wafted through Sunspear's halls. A far cry from the musty gloom of some northern keep. And so, near the end of his 3rd year on the Iron Throne, King Bronn prepared to leave King's Landing once more, this time to journey south. He placed the Red Keep under the watchful eye of his most loyal advisors and took with him a well-armed retinue, though smaller than the one for his grand tour. He reasoned that Dorne would see a massive entourage as an act of intimidation, and he preferred to appear confident, not threatening. The journey took him through the Reach and then across the Dornish marches, where the air grew hot and dry, and the sun beat down mercilessly. They pressed on through passes that once bristled with skirmishes between the Marcher lords and the Dornish. At every fort and watchtower along the way, the banners of the king's sigil, a new emblem he had devised, a crowned gold coin on a black field, flew side by side with Martell spears. Finally, Sunspear itself appeared in the distance, its slender towers and domes shimmering like a mirage against the pale sky. The reception was indeed lavish. Dornish noblemen and women wore brightly colored silks, gold jewelry, and veils, moving through courtyards filled with fountains that trickled water over smooth tiles. The air smelled of spiced wine and citrus. They greeted Bronn with courtesy, though an undercurrent of wariness still hung in the air. Dorne had repelled dragons before. A mere Sellsword king might not awe them as easily as other regions. Yet they recognized that times had changed, and forging an accord with the man who held the throne could benefit them greatly. It was in one of those shady, vine-covered courtyards that Bronn first met the woman rumored to be a potential match. She was indeed striking, with dark hair that fell in loose waves and eyes the color of amber. She greeted him with a respectful dip of her head, but did not avert her gaze in demure submission. Instead, she studied him with the keen curiosity of someone used to evaluating potential foes. They spoke of many things: travel, trade, law, the state of the realm. She challenged him on certain policies, praising his fairness in some matters while questioning his harsh tactics in putting down rebels. He gave as good as he got, joking about Dornish pride, yet acknowledging their famed sense of honor. If it was a dance, it was one with subtle, clever footwork rather than flamboyant spins. Over the next days, a pattern emerged: feasts in Bronn's honor, tours of Sunspear's ramparts, hunts in the Red Mountains. At every turn, the lady was present, engaged in conversation with the king. They debated possible terms of a treaty, hammered out details regarding mutual defense, open trade, and the possibility of a royal marriage. The Martell leadership seemed content to let this interplay unfold, watching carefully from the sidelines. King Bronn, never one to be swayed by sweet words alone, tested the waters in his own way. He arranged small private meetings, bringing along only his trusted advisors, to discuss exactly what Dorne wanted in exchange for an alliance, and what they would concede. From Dorne's perspective, an alliance with the crown could restore some influence they had lost over the generations. They wanted to preserve their legal traditions, keep a measure of independence, and ensure that any heirs from the marriage could not be set aside if the king found a different match. Bronn, for his part, wanted guaranteed support against internal rebellions, the assurance that Dornish ports would open wide for trade from Essos, and the understanding that Dorne would not harbor any pretenders to the throne. It was a complicated puzzle, but each day they found a piece that fit. Bronn found himself drawn to the lady's sharp wit and the challenge she posed. She was not shy about her ambitions, nor was she naive about the precarious nature of power. In her, he saw a reflection of the cunning he valued in himself. He was still reluctant to bind himself in marriage, but if he had to do it, better it be someone he could respect, perhaps even trust a little. Late one night, after a feast that involved dancing under lanternlit trees, Bronn stood on a balcony overlooking the starlit sea. The lady appeared at his side, wearing a loose gown that caught the moonlight. They talked in low voices, with only the gentle lapping of the waves as accompaniment. She mused about how Dorne and the rest of Westeros had clashed for centuries, and how this union might finally bring an era of peace. He snorted softly, remarking that in Westeros, peace was always temporary. She laughed, acknowledging the truth of it. Then she turned her amber gaze on him and asked, But if it buys us time to strengthen our positions, why not seize it? He had no clever quip for once, merely a thoughtful nod. When dawn broke the next day, Bronn called a meeting with the Martell regents. He proposed a formal betrothal. The terms would grant Dorne autonomy in certain matters, trial by combat, inheritance laws, the freedom to impose its own local taxes, while affirming that the region was unequivocally part of the Seven Kingdoms under the Iron Throne. In exchange, Dorne would lend troops if the crown was threatened by external invasion or internal revolt. They would also lower tariffs for crown-sponsored merchants passing through Dornish ports. The final detail was that he would marry the lady, ensuring a dynastic bond. The Martell regents agreed, though they had their own set of conditions about how any children would be educated and a certain trust fund for them. Bronn, after some haggling, conceded. The alliance was sealed. The next weeks were a blur of arrangements. Ravens flew to King's Landing, announcing the betrothal. Some in the capital were stunned at the news, especially those who had hoped the king would remain unwed. Reactions ranged from fury to delight among various factions. But the pragmatics saw the sense in it. Securing Dorne meant securing a crucial flank of the realm. That was something even the king's detractors had to acknowledge. Meanwhile, in Sunspear, the final wedding preparations commenced. Tailors and seamstresses fussed over garments. Stonemasons erected a grand dais in the courtyard for the ceremony. Musicians rehearsed day and night. Bronn himself watched the hustle with a stoic amusement. He'd been to fancy weddings before, usually as a guard or a guest there to ensure a noble's safety. Now he was at the center of the spectacle. Perhaps he would have dreaded it more if the lady had been some naive child or a cunning manipulator devoid of any genuine intelligence. But she wasn't. She understood the game just as he did, and she played her own hand with confidence. He could respect that. In due course, the wedding day arrived, scorching hot under the Dornish sun. Yet the crowd in the courtyard was vibrant with color. Dornish nobles wore their best silks, while the king's retinue donned polished armor or the black and gold sigil of their liege. The lady wore a flowing dress of deep red, embroidered with golden suns. Bronn, never one for finery, nonetheless had donned a regal doublet of black velvet lined with gold thread. A circlet of gold rested on his brow, proclaiming his status even to the farthest corners of the courtyard. She approached him, and he saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Nervousness, excitement, perhaps both. A hush fell over the onlookers as the ceremony began. Words were exchanged in the old undulled tradition, officiated by a septon, but with a Dornish twist. Vows were spoken, wine was sipped, swords were touched to hearts in symbolic gestures. At one point, the lady pricked her finger and pressed a drop of her blood to Bronn's palm, a Dornish custom signifying the mingling of fates. He pressed his own pricked finger to hers, feeling a momentary sting. Then it was done. They were man and wife, king and queen, though Dorne would likely still think of her as their princess at heart. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, though some wore forced smiles. A new era was officially underway. The feast that followed was as wild and lively as anything Bronn had ever seen. Dornish wines flowed in abundance. Fiery dishes danced on tongues. Dancers and drummers pounded out rhythms that echoed in the starlit courtyard. The newly married pair presided over it all from a raised table, greeting well-wishers, receiving lavish gifts, and exchanging knowing smiles. Bronn made sure to drink in moderation. He'd be damned if he lost track of his wits on his wedding night. Later, there would be a bedding ceremony, a tradition across Westeros, though carried out with varying degrees of formality in different regions. In Dorne, it was more playful than bawdy, and the couple soon found themselves escorted to their chambers amidst laughter and applause. Before the door closed, the new queen whispered a teasing remark about how Bronn might find Dornish bedchambers more hospitable than he expected. He grinned roguishly and said something equally irreverent. When the door shut, all the ceremony and spectacle fell away, leaving two individuals who had forged an alliance in the fires of ambition and necessity. Whether genuine affection could grow between them remained to be seen, but for now they understood each other. That night, the swirl of music and laughter from the courtyard faded into the background. a reminder that the realm they each hoped to guide had turned a new page. The next morning, while the city of Sunspear still dozed in the aftermath of the festivities, Bronn, king of the Seven Kingdoms, awoke beside his new queen. He stared at the sunlight spilling through the shutters and thought of all that lay ahead. The precarious peace, the reforms that still needed tending, the possibility of heirs, the unending string of threats from within and without. Yet as he rose and splashed water on his face, he felt no dread, only a sharp awareness that the game continued. Maybe it always would. That was the nature of power in Westeros. And if anyone had told him years ago, while he was still scrounging for coin and risking his neck for lords he didn't care about, that he would one day rule all of Westeros, he would have laughed in their face. But life had a twisted sense of humor. Now, the Sellsword was king. The city was stirring beneath the southern sun, and the realm awaited his next move. A faint smirk touched his lips as he reached for a robe of finely woven silk. He remembered an old Jape Tyrion used to say, "Once you've accepted your flaws, no one can use them against you. Perhaps once you've accepted the improbable seat of power you occupy, no one can easily topple you from it." That was Bronn's private credo anyway. He donned the robe and stepped to the window, casting his gaze beyond Sunspear's towers, out to the wide world. The morning air felt alive with possibility. So he took a breath and prepared to face whatever came next, secure in the knowledge that he had always been a survivor, and the Iron Throne, for better or worse, belonged to him now. Bronn rose from the bed the morning after his wedding, drawn by the pale light that seeped through the shuttered windows. A breeze rustled the gauzy drapes, carrying in the faint scent of citrus orchards and the desert beyond. Dorne was all contrasts. Scorching sun and cool shadows, sweet wines and bitter poisons, heartfelt greetings and undercurrents of simmering ambition. If there was a place in Westeros that suited a Sellsword who had become king, it might be here, where strength and cunning were prized as much as noble blood. He glanced back at the woman still Abed, his new wife, Princess Inez Martell. Technically, she was now Queen Inez, but Bronn knew that among her people, she would be forever a Martell, with all the history and pride that entailed. Her dark hair lay spread across the pillows, and her eyes were half open, studying him just as intently as he had once studied potential foes across a battlefield. He padded across the tiled floor, splashed water on his face from a porcelain basin, then dried off with a cloth embroidered with the Martell sun and spear sigil. He had an entire day of ceremonies and farewells ahead. By sundown, he and his retinue would begin the journey back to King's Landing, unless he decided to linger in Dorne a while longer. The notion tempted him. In the short span he'd been here, he'd grown fond of its flavors and colors. But a king could not dawdle too long on honeymoon pleasures while the realm moved on without him. When he turned, he saw that Inez had slipped out of bed. She moved gracefully, one hand brushing aside the diaphanous curtain that separated the bedchamber from a small adjoining terrace. Sunlight hit her olive skin as she stepped outside to peer over the walls of Sunspear. Bronn joined her, aware of the shift in temperature the moment he crossed that threshold. Out here, the day already blazed with the kind of heat that could shrivel weaker men. "Listen," she said softly, tilting her head toward the city below. The capital of Dorne was waking up, the murmur of voices, hooves on cobblestones, and the clang of distant smithies drifting up to them. "My people are gossiping about our wedding." "They'd hardly be Dornish if they didn't gossip," Bronn replied dryly, letting his gaze wander across the sprawl of stucco buildings, bright awnings and market stalls. "Let them talk. I'm more concerned with what we do next." She gave him a sidelong glance. "I expected no less from a man who sees every day as a negotiation. But sometimes, rumor and reputation shape a ruler's power more than swords and gold." He shrugged. "Swords and gold have served me fine so far." A faint smile played on her lips. "Perhaps we'll show each other how to balance them all." She brushed her hair back. "We have a final audience with my uncles this morning. Then there's a feast, smaller than last night's, to send you off. And you'll be coming with me," he said. It was not a question. Part of the marriage agreement was that she would join him in King's Landing, so the people and the lords would see their new queen in the Red Keep. Her amber eyes flickered over him with quiet amusement. "I will, yes. I've already sent my personal retinue ahead on the lesser roads. Don't worry. I'll be right by your side, my king." The slightest emphasis on that last phrase told him she was teasing. Dorne had a long tradition of strong, independent rulers, especially its women. She might technically be his queen consort, but she would never see herself as subservient. He found that more appealing than he expected. He glanced down at her hand, noticing again the fine scars on her knuckles. Calluses from years of training with a dagger, she had said. He liked that she had some steel in her. Westeros was dangerous enough for a king, let alone a queen from a region that many in the realm viewed with suspicion. Best she know how to defend herself. "Then let's get on with it," he said, stepping back inside to dress. By midday, they had concluded their audience with Prince Corin Martell, the closest thing Dorne had to a ruling head aside from Inez herself. Corin was her older cousin, a man of mild temperament but sharp wits. He'd presided over much of the negotiations that brought Bronn and Inez together in marriage. Now, in Sunspear's grand audience chamber, a columned hall open to the scorching breeze, Corin reiterated Dorne's formal commitment to the Iron Throne under King Bronn, with the customary disclaimers about Dornish legal autonomy. Bronn offered the same well-practiced courtesies in return. Words, he thought, were easier spent than gold, but sometimes they could seal bargains that coin and swords would struggle to secure. After the final midday feast, a smaller affair, though still filled with exotic fruit, spiced meats, and wines that made one's head swim, Bronn and Inez mounted horses in the courtyard. He had his usual retinue, a squad of Kingsguard, a handful of trusted knights, servants, and advisors. She brought her own complement: Dornish guards in bright silks, a pair of ladies-in-waiting, and a steward who seemed to fuss over every detail. The people of Sunspear lined the streets to watch them depart. The two of them waved in acknowledgement, though Bronn noticed that the applause was polite rather than raucous. A quiet acceptance, maybe, or a wariness that the union might usher in changes not all Dornish wanted. He'd faced worse receptions. At least they weren't throwing rotten fruit. They set out across the stony desert. Heat haze shimmered on the horizon, turning distant dunes into illusions of water. Bronn wore light leathers rather than heavier riding gear. Dorne's climate was punishing enough without lugging half a suit of plate. He rode at Inez's side, while behind them spread their combined escort. Conversation was sporadic at first, each of them focused on the difficulty of riding in such conditions. Eventually, they reached the Prince's Pass, climbing into cooler heights. Nightfall found them camped near a desert oasis, ringed by a few date palms. Tents were erected, and though it was nothing compared to the lavishness of the castle, the Dornish still prepared a hearty meal for the king and queen. After dinner, they sat by a small fire, the bright stars overhead. Inez asked questions about King's Landing, its layout, its smells, the sorts of amusements that might occupy her time while Bronn managed affairs of state. He answered with the blunt truth. The city was big, overcrowded, full of stench from the tanneries and the latrine pits, but also brimming with life and trade. "If you can handle Sunspear in summer, you can handle King's Landing," he said, though he refrained from mentioning how brutal the capital's politics could be. She'd learn soon enough. And in any case, if she was cunning enough to maneuver Dornish courts, perhaps she could handle the vipers of the Red Keep. They spoke a little of the future, how their marriage might be viewed by the realm, how the lords would respond, how quickly she might establish her own retinue in the Red Keep. Bronn was used to being the center of decisions, but he recognized that Inez would want her own space, her own circle of friends and confidants. That, too, was part of the bargain. By the time they retired to their tent, an unspoken sense of guarded optimism bound them. They'd taken a gamble on each other, both for political gain and for the simple fact that they respected the steel in each other's spirit. The journey back took longer than a fortnight. They navigated the passes and descended into the Reach, where the weather turned milder and the landscapes more verdant. Word of the royal convoy's approach preceded them, so local lords scrambled to greet them at vantage points along the roads, offering bread and salt, token gifts, and often sly attempts at currying favor. Some presented Inez with flowers and perfumes. Others petitioned King Bronn for trade privileges or new charters. Bronn brushed off most of these supplications, reminding them that official business would be handled once he was back in King's Landing. But he also made a few mental notes. Certain lords had potential for loyalty and profit. Others had petty grievances that might be manipulated if needed. They paused at Highgarden for a night, lodging in the seat that Bronn technically held as Lord Paramount of the Reach, a title granted to him in the tumultuous aftermath of the wars, when the Tyrells were all but gone. Inez was suitably impressed by the grandeur of the gardens, though she noted that Dornish courtyards were often more ingeniously irrigated. Bronn, in turn, was amused by how quickly the local lords tried to fawn over his new queen. He suspected they hoped to win her ear. Inez played along gracefully, but afterwards, as they retired for the night in Highgarden's guest wing, she murmured to Bronn that the flatteries rang hollow. "They see me as a shortcut to your good graces," she said. He agreed with a knowing grin. "The Reach is a land of honeyed words. But don't be fooled. They can be as thorny as their roses. Make sure any bargain you strike is sealed with more than talk." She gave a mischievous smile. "I might say the same for you, my king. Didn't you once climb the social ladder by charming various lords and ladies?" He shrugged, unashamed. "I climbed it by taking opportunities. Charm was just the garnish." A day later, they left Highgarden behind, crossing the Mander River and continuing eastward. The roads were in decent shape, a testament to the recent improvements Bronn had pushed through. They passed farmland regrowing after the devastation of wars long ended. Harvests looked healthy, the small folk busy in the fields. Occasionally, villagers would gather by the roadside to gawk at the passing royalty and offer small gifts. A basket of apples, a jug of fresh milk, a cluster of wildflowers. Bronn accepted these gestures with a casual nod, while Inez offered a warm smile or a coin in thanks. The smallest gestures of kindness went a long way in securing loyalty, especially among peasants who had endured so much. Bronn had learned that if the people had full bellies and a sense of hope, they were less likely to rise up in rebellion. When at last they reached the Crownlands, the autumn air had begun to crisp at the edges. Summer was fading, though it still lingered in the south, and the roads here were busier, crowded with wagons bringing goods to King's Landing. Every day, the retinue grew as local knights and minor lords came out to escort the king and queen safely to the capital. By the time the city's walls appeared on the horizon, the traveling party was nearly 200 strong. King's Landing was as teeming and chaotic as ever. Smoke from the chimneys and cook fires hung over the rooftops in a hazy pall. The Blackwater Rush glittered in the afternoon sun, dotted with ships coming and going from the harbor. Inez stared at the sprawl of buildings climbing up toward the Red Keep, her expression unreadable. Bronn guessed she was both intrigued and wary. He recalled how he had felt the first time he saw the city, back when it was just another opportunity waiting to be seized. Now, he owned it at least as much as any ruler could claim to own a place so large and unpredictable. The city gates swung open, allowing the royal convoy to enter amid a throng of curious onlookers. Gold cloaks lined the streets, trying to keep order as people shouted greetings or tried to press forward for a better look. Some cheered, some simply watched. A few scattered insults might have floated from the back of the crowd, but they were drowned out by the general clamor. Bronn was used to the jostle and noise. Inez kept a regal demeanor, her posture straight, her gaze ahead, as if determined not to let the teeming masses unsettle her. They made their way up the winding streets toward the Red Keep, passing through the city's various districts. Flea Bottom, with its tangle of alleys and foul stench, was left behind. The wealthier districts nearer the top of Aegon's high hill displayed tall houses of brick and stone, with ornate balconies. Finally, they reached the castle gates. The Red Keep's red walls rose over them, banners snapping in the breeze. The black field with a crowned gold coin, Bronn's personal sigil, alongside the seven-pointed star of the faith and the great house sigils that had once decorated these ramparts in ages past. In the courtyard, The gathered nobility of King's Landing offered a formal welcome. Lords and ladies in colorful silks bowed. The King's Guard, in their white cloaks and shining armor, stood at attention. Bronn dismounted, then assisted Inez from her horse. She took in the scene. Knights standing in neat rows, servants bustling to gather luggage, courtiers craning their necks for a glimpse of her, and maintained her composure. Bronn introduced a few key figures: his master of coin, his master of laws, the captain of the city watch, and others. Inez greeted them politely, though he could see her measuring each person's bearing and manner. A hush fell over the courtyard as the master of ceremonies stepped forward to call out in a booming voice, "Behold, King Bronn of the Crown, defender of the realm, the Sellsword King, Lord Paramount of the Reach, and rightful occupant of the Iron Throne. Behold, Queen Inez Martell, now Inez of the Crown, rightful consort of the Seven Kingdoms, Princess of Dorne by her birth and lineage." The titles were still a jumble, as no one had quite settled on the best way to style a king who had none of the storied lineages that typically accompanied the throne. Nevertheless, the crowd bowed dutifully. Bronn exchanged a glance with Inez, amused at how forced the entire display was. "Welcome to the Red Keep," he said quietly. "You'll get used to it soon enough." Inside, the corridors felt familiar and yet newly charged with tension. The king's retinue peeled off, some to stables, some to their own quarters. The queen's Dornish guard set to unpacking her belongings. As they navigated the labyrinth of halls, Bronn pointed out a few sections of the keep that had been rebuilt or upgraded. "Reinforced these walls after the last scuffle," he murmured, "and that tower used to be half ruined until I put coin into it." He paused near a narrow door that led to a secret passage, once rumored to have been constructed by Maegor the Cruel. He kept that door locked, with only a handful of people entrusted with the key. Inez listened, at times asking pointed questions about the architecture or the city's history. She seemed particularly interested in the placement of guards and the rumored existence of hidden tunnels. He chuckled at her thoroughness, but made a note to be sure she got a reliable map of the keep. In a place like this, knowledge was power, and ignorance could be fatal. They reached the queen's new apartments, a suite previously occupied by the consorts of kings from more traditional dynasties. Servants scurried to open shutters, light incense, and lay out fresh linens. The windows overlooked Blackwater Bay, giving a sweeping view of incoming ships. Inez stepped to the sill, inhaling the sea air, no doubt comparing it to the dryness of Dorne. Bronn leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "If there's anything you want changed in here, just say the word. The keep is yours to shape, as far as I care." "I appreciate that," she replied. Her tone was measured, but her eyes carried a subtle warmth. "Dorne is my home, but I intend to make a place for myself here. Perhaps add some Dornish tapestries, or a small corner of the courtyard for desert flowers. I suspect the climate won't suit them, but I'll see if we can replicate it somehow." He gave a nod. The notion of a Dornish garden within the Red Keep was oddly appealing, a living testament to her heritage, and a reminder to everyone else that she brought more than a name to the throne. That evening, they held a modest reception in the throne room. Bronn purposely kept it smaller than usual, refusing to stage a second wedding feast for the capital. After all, they'd had more than enough celebrations in Dorne. The lords and ladies present offered gifts and good wishes. Some praised the new queen's exotic beauty, while others inquired about her political aims with polite duplicity. Inez responded with a grace and tact that impressed even Bronn. He was more accustomed to shutting down such questions with a blunt quip, but she parried them in a way that left them none the wiser, yet not offended. Finally, after all the pleasantries, the king dismissed the court. He stood before the Iron Throne, its twisted metal and jagged edges a harsh reminder of the realm's violent history, and let out a long breath as the last courtiers filtered out. Inez lingered by his side. "You don't like that chair, do you?" she asked, following his gaze to the monstrous seat. He smirked. "I like that it reminds everyone how precarious power is. But no, I can't say it's comfortable on the backside." She touched one of the melted blades, careful not to cut herself. "It's a symbol. Some in Dorne used to scoff that we had no such seat, no monstrous relic hammered together by dragon's fire. We had a throne, but far simpler. Yet here we are. Here we are, Bronn echoed. He felt the weight of the crown pressing on him, not just physically, though the gold circlet did feel heavier by the day, but mentally. A cell's word might wander off when a contract grew too cumbersome. A king had no such luxury. He was in this for good, or until someone took it from him. They left the throne room, and as they walked the corridors, a messenger intercepted them with letters that had arrived during the king's absence. Some bore broken seals from the Master of Whispers, indicating urgent updates. Others were from Northern Lords, Vale Lords, and even a few from Essos. Inez watched carefully as Bronn flipped through them, scanning addresses. He recognized one from the Westerlands. The Lannister cousin currently holding Casterly Rock wrote with flowery words about trade prospects. But Bronn knew it was mostly an attempt to gain favorable terms. He pocketed that one. Another came from the Stormlands, referencing a matter of a rumored pirate fleet near Shipbreaker Bay. He tucked that aside to read more thoroughly. Then one from the north. A short, terse note acknowledging the marriage alliance but offering no congratulations. Just a statement that the North would maintain its usual obligations. That was very much in character for the Northerners. And at the bottom of the pile was a letter bearing no sigil. Its seal was plain red wax, unadorned. Bronn frowned, sliding a finger under the seal. The parchment revealed a few neatly written lines. An anonymous hand. Beware the renewed stirrings of the true and noble hand. Word travels that they have found a new patron abroad. A dragon seed or a lost stag, none can say for certain. Trust none who come bearing secret birthrights. He felt a flicker of annoyance. The true and noble hand, that rebellious faction that had once caused such trouble in the Crownlands, still evidently breathed. He'd had them ruthlessly hunted down, imprisoned, or executed. But rebellions often died hard in Westeros, especially those fueled by nostalgia for some rightful king. He grunted and handed the note to Inez. She read it, her brow knitting. "This group stirs again?" she asked quietly. "Could be nonsense. Could be something." He shrugged, but his eyes were guarded. "I'll have the Master of Whispers look into it. Probably just a bunch of old blood loyalists who can't abide a man like me on the throne." She tapped the parchment thoughtfully. "Or they might have found a new rallying point. The letter speaks of a possible Targaryen or Baratheon claimant." Bronn snorted. "We've heard that line before. Every so often, someone claims to have found a lost dragon's egg or a hidden Targaryen bastard. Usually leads nowhere. It's worth taking seriously," Inez replied. "Even rumors can spark trouble. If they get the backing of a major house." "I know." He slipped the letter into his coat. "I'll speak to my spymaster tomorrow. No sense letting it fester." Together, they resumed their walk, the letter's contents weighing on both their minds. In the flickering light of the sconces, Bronn felt an old weariness creep in. The awareness that ruling meant facing threats from shadows as well as from armies. Inez must have sensed the shift in his mood. She placed a hand on his arm. "Don't let them sour our first night in the keep together," she said. "Threats will always come, but tonight, we can at least enjoy a moment's rest." He flashed a tired smile. "You're right. Let's do just that." They parted ways soon after. She needed to settle her retinue in the Queen's apartments, while he had business in the Royal Solar with a few of his top counselors. But later that night, they met privately for supper in a small drawing room that overlooked the bay. A simple meal, roasted game, bread, and a pitcher of Arbor Red sufficed. Bronn found himself relaxing more easily than he expected. Perhaps the presence of a partner who understood the game was a relief. Yet as they talked of inconsequential things, the view, the flavor of the wine, the gossip from the feast, he kept recalling the letter about the true and noble hand. So many threats had been neutralized since he took the crown, but the realm was vast, and pockets of discontent festered in surprising corners. He would not rest easy until he was certain they posed no imminent danger. The next morning, at a meeting of the small council, Bronn brought up the matter. Seated around a large oaken table were his key advisors, the master of coin, a reformed hedge knight named Garin, who had a surprising aptitude for ledgers, the lady regent of the Vale who served as master of laws, his master of whispers, a lean, taciturn man named Rudge, once a mercenary across the narrow sea, and a few others. Inez attended, standing behind Bronn's chair at first, but he invited her to join them properly. She accepted, and those around the table exchanged curious glances. A queen on the small council was not unheard of, but it signaled that she would be actively involved in governance. Bronn passed the anonymous letter around. Word is, these true and noble-hand rebels might be stirring again. The letter claims they found a new patron, someone across the sea, possibly, or maybe a highborn house in Westeros that's grown discontent. I want them sniffed out. Rudge, the master of whispers, flipped the parchment over and studied it with a frown. We crushed most of their cells in the Crownlands. Any survivors likely fled to remote areas. If they're stirring again, they might have new leadership. Could be some fool in Pentos or Lys funding them, or it could be someone in the Reach or the Westerlands with gold to spare. Inez spoke up, her tone measured. The letter mentions a dragon seed or a lost stag. Are there any known bastard lines from House Targaryen or Baratheon we haven't accounted for? Rudge scratched at the faint stubble on his chin. Baratheon bastards are numerous, but the ones with any real claim are either dead or in hiding. As for Targaryens, rumors pop up every few years, but no one has produced a credible heir. Could be a bluff. Or it could be some associate sponsor trying to conjure a Targaryen pretender as a figurehead. People love a good lost prince story. Garin, the master of coin, interjected. My networks in Bravos and Pentos haven't reported anything about Targaryen pretenders. But that doesn't mean it isn't happening quietly. I'll send word to my contacts to be extra vigilant. Bronn leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping on the armrest. Good. Rudge, double your efforts in the Crownlands. Sniff out any sign of them. If they're operating in the open somewhere, we'll root them out. If they're lurking in some lord's cellar, I want to know which lord is harboring them. Rudge gave a curt nod. As you say, your grace. With that, they turned to other matters. The treasury was in decent shape, thanks to Bronn's reforms that improved trade and streamlined taxes. The roads, especially near the Crownlands, had never been safer, but the same couldn't be said of the Riverlands, where scattered bandits still harassed merchants. The North maintained a cool distance, paying taxes but offering little else. The Iron Islands were quiet for the moment. No major raids had been reported, likely because the King's navy had proven too formidable. Dorne, of course, was on better terms than ever, with the marriage alliance cementing that relationship. Inez listened attentively to each report, occasionally asking pointed questions. For instance, she inquired about the possibility of expanding trade routes from Dorne to Gulltown in the Vale, circumventing some of the more troublesome land routes. Garin seemed intrigued by the idea, noting that it could bring new revenue to the crown. The Master of Laws asked about ensuring disputes among merchants were arbitrated fairly, a project that might require new legal frameworks. Bronn didn't mind the complexity. Complexity often meant more opportunities to assert control and siphon profits. But it also meant he needed capable administrators, and so far he had a handful that he trusted, or at least distrusted less than others. As the meeting wound down, Bronn dismissed the council with instructions to act on the decisions they'd made. He lingered behind with Inez. She rose, stretching her arms slightly, a subtle sign that the meeting had been long. You seemed comfortable, he remarked. She arched a brow. I studied how Dorne's courts work from a young age. Much of it is about hearing petitions, balancing interests, and making sure your allies and enemies both see that you can handle power. It's not so different from what I expected. Bronn grunted. King's Landing is bigger, Messier. But you'll do fine. He paused, considering her for a moment. Just remember, there are those who'd resent you for being Dornish, or for being so close to me. They'll scheme. They always do. Her lips curved in a half-smile. Good. I prefer open conflict to hidden daggers. Let them reveal themselves. He almost laughed. You might regret that when you see how many hidden daggers lurk in the Red Keep. But never say I didn't warn you. In the days that followed, life at court settled into a new rhythm. Inez set about organizing her quarters, interviewing ladies-in-waiting from various houses, and exploring the keep. She made a point to visit the kitchens, the stables, and even the dungeons, showing curiosity about every layer of the castle's workings. The castle staff soon discovered that the new queen had a mind for detail and a willingness to listen, but also an undercurrent of Dornish pride that demanded respect. Bronn, for his part, returned to the endless tasks of ruling. He held court thrice a week, hearing petitions from all manner of supplicants. Peasants claiming a lord had cheated them of land, merchants wanting lower import duties, knights seeking titles or recognition. He tried to keep the proceedings brisk, refusing to let them devolve into pompous displays. More than one lord found himself cut off mid-speech if he rambled. One day, a contingent of men from the Riverlands arrived, bringing word of a new group of outlaws calling themselves the Green Hoods. They'd taken to robbing merchant caravans and burning tax collector offices. Bronn scowled as he listened to the complaint. He remembered his initial strategy, placing bounties on the outlaws to encourage betrayal from within. It had worked for a while, but evidently some groups had grown bolder. He turned to his master of laws, who sat at his side. "Deal with them," he said bluntly. "I want them gone." She inclined her head. "I'll send crown forces to assist the local lord's men. We'll root them out. If they're operating under the protection of a nearby lord, we'll address that as well." Inez, who was observing from a seat near the dais, leaned forward. "Might it help to offer an amnesty for minor followers if they lay down arms? That often saps support from the leadership, isolating them." Bronn considered it. He'd never been one for lenience where rebels were concerned, but he also recognized the practicality of dividing an outlaw band. "All right," he said, "issue the offer. But once the deadline passes, no mercy. Make that clear." The Riverlanders bowed, relieved to have the king's attention. Some courtiers murmured approval. Others eyed the queen with curiosity, noting how she'd influenced policy. Bronn let them talk. He was too old a hand at this game to think that one suggestion signaled any weakness. Instead, it showed that he was confident enough to consider new strategies. After the court session, a messenger arrived carrying a sealed scroll from the north, delivered by a rider who had braved the King's Road with some urgency. Bronn retired to his solar to read it privately. Inez followed him, invited by a brief nod. He let her see the contents. It was a message from Lord Cregan Stark, son of the Stark who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. The letter was brief, stating that a harsh winter was predicted in the north, that trade caravans might be delayed, and that the north sought relief from certain taxes on imported grain. Bronn tossed the scroll onto a small table. "They always want special treatment, the north. They're either half-starving or half-freezing." Inez skimmed the writing. "But if the winter is truly severe, it could lead to famine. A starving populace can cause unrest, even in the north." He exhaled. "I know. Damned if I do, damned if I don't. If I waive some taxes, I lose revenue, and the other lords might clamor for the same favor. But if I don't, the north might claim I'm starving them, sowing seeds of rebellion." She tapped a finger to her lips in thought. "Could we arrange some mutual benefit? If we reduce their grain tax, perhaps they'd open more lucrative fur or timber trade routes, or supply something else the crown needs." Bronn's eyes narrowed. "You think you can negotiate that with them?" "Perhaps. I've heard that the new Stark is more open to compromise than his predecessors. Let me correspond with them. Dorne has never had the best relations with the North, but as your wife and queen, I might stand apart from old grudges. And I suspect they'll appreciate a more diplomatic tone than your typical missives." He grunted, half amused. "My typical missives get the job done. But fine, give it a try. If they're amenable, we'll talk specifics. Otherwise, they can freeze for all I care." Inez nodded. "I'll dispatch a raven tomorrow." Thus began her more visible involvement in crown diplomacy. While Bronn had no illusions about turning into some gallant, diplomatic figure himself, he recognized Inez could fill a role that he could not. She was born to a noble house, skilled in the subtlety of courtly graces, and not weighed down by the baggage that came from being a low-born Sellsword. Let her handle the Northerners, the Vale, maybe even some of the Reach Lords who were still prickly about the Tyrells. It freed him to focus on other matters, fortifying defenses, ensuring the treasury stayed flush, and rooting out threats like the True and Noble Hand. Days turned into weeks. Rumors circulated that a band of suspicious foreigners had landed in the Stormlands, bearing a crate of old documents that might prove some lost lineage. Bronn dispatched men to investigate, but they returned with little. The foreigners were gone by the time they arrived, leaving behind only rumors of a silver-haired princeling. Some swore they'd glimpsed the faint purple eyes of Valyrian descent. Others claimed it was all a drunken tale conjured by a tavern keeper who wanted to charge extra for lodging. Meanwhile, the Master of Whispers quietly reported that at least 2 minor lords in the Crownlands had suspicious visitors traveling by night, men who might be recruiting for a new insurgency. Bronn gave the order to have these watchers followed and, if necessary, encouraged to reveal their employers. Gold could buy answers and threats could back them up. In the midst of these tensions, Bronn and Inez maintained a public image of unity. They dined together in the Great Hall, receiving envoys from across Westeros and Essos, who were eager to see what the new queen was like. By now, the court was abuzz with speculation as to whether the king and queen would produce an heir. Whenever asked, Bronn dodged the question, unwilling to commit to anything that would fan the flames of further political maneuvering. Inez answered with a knowing smile, leaving it ambiguous. Some nights, after the business of the realm had concluded, they shared quieter moments. A private meal in her apartments, a stroll along the Red Keep's walls under the moonlight, or even a sparring session with wooden daggers in one of the lesser-used training yards. On one such night, they faced each other under torchlight, the yard empty but for a single guard posted at a distance. Inez moved with a lithe grace, her wooden dagger flashing. Bronn parried, letting muscle memory guide him. He realized he missed the old days when life was as simple as swordplay and cunning. Now, every action was steeped in consequence. Still, for a moment, it felt good to focus on the immediate challenge of not getting cracked on the knuckles by his wife's quick strikes. "You're holding back," she teased, darting in. He caught her wrist lightly. "I've seen what real steel can do. If these were real blades, we'd be missing a few toes by now." She disengaged with a twist, stepping back, her eyes glinting. "Or we'd be dancing a more dangerous dance." They ended the session with no clear victor, just a mutual respect. Bronn found himself slightly breathless, though not just from exertion. There was something invigorating about crossing wooden blades with someone whose mind was as sharp as the steel she carried. In the following months, Inez's negotiations with the North bore fruit. Lord Cregan Stark responded positively, agreeing to a revised trade deal. The Crown would reduce certain taxes on grain shipments, and in return, the North would open new routes for fur and timber that bypassed the normal toll roads of the Riverlands, funneling more direct revenue to the Crown. It was a win-win, at least on parchment. Whether it would work in practice remained to be seen. But the letters carried a more cordial tone than any Stark had used toward the Iron Throne in years. Bronn nodded in satisfaction when Inez showed him the final arrangement. "Well done," he admitted. "You've got them to play along." She gave a small shrug. "They remain proud, and I wouldn't put it past them to renege if they sense weakness. But for now, we have an accord." Encouraged by this success, she proposed setting up a similar approach with other regions, like the Vale or the Westerlands, to ensure stable alliances. Bronn gave her leeway to do so. He saw no downside in forging economic links that bound the lords to the Crown's prosperity. Still, he reminded her, if any region tries to get too clever, we'll show them who holds the power. I won't waste time on endless squabbling. As Inez delved deeper into these talks, Bronn continued his campaign against the lingering rebels. He sent out more Crown soldiers to the Riverlands, the Stormlands, and the Crownlands itself, tracking rumors of conspirators and smuggling rings that might finance a new uprising. At times, the soldiers returned empty-handed. Other times, they brought in bedraggled men who swore fealty or insisted they'd only been following orders from a figure no one had ever seen. One chilly autumn morning, a messenger arrived from the Stormlands bearing more concrete news. A man claiming Baratheon blood had appeared at a minor castle near Cape Wrath, seeking allies. The local lord had sent a raven to warn the king. The man's story was that he was the unacknowledged son of King Robert Baratheon, and that an ancient maester's records proved it. Bronn nearly laughed at the brazenness. Robert had sired more bastards than a brothel had fleas, but none with a serious claim had ever threatened the throne, at least not since the last major civil wars. Still, if this fellow had the cunning or gold to rally supporters, it could be trouble. The true and noble hand might latch onto any flicker of legitimate nobility, even if it was the 10th bastard in line. So Bronn ordered a detachment of his best men to Cape Wrath to investigate discreetly. "Bring him in alive if he's real," he told the knight leading the group. "Dead if he's troublesome, but don't let him slip away." The knight saluted and departed. Within a fortnight, the group returned, with no sign of the so-called Baratheon heir. The local lord explained that the man had vanished, presumably catching wind of the soldiers' approach. They found scraps of documents in the castle's guest chamber, but nothing definitive. Word on the roads suggested he might have fled by ship toward the Stepstones. Bronn ground his teeth at the news. Another ghost, another rumor. This was how rebellions festered, through myths and fleeting sightings that stoked discontent, even if no one could confirm them. While these frustrations mounted, life at court carried on. Merchants from Essos flocked to the capital, bringing exotic silks, spices, and strange trinkets. The harbor bustled with trade, fueling the treasury. In turn, Bronn poured coin into the city's infrastructure. New sewers, additional guard posts, and expansions to the dockyards. He reasoned that a wealthy, well-guarded city was less likely to turn on him, and each improvement meant more taxes down the line. Inez oversaw a festival that marked the harvest season, encouraging local farmers and artisans to showcase their goods in the city squares. It was a modest affair compared to the grand tournaments of old, but it boosted spirits. The small folk appreciated that the queen seemed engaged with everyday life. Meanwhile, Bronn took the opportunity to make a few more pronounced gestures of justice. He publicly pardoned a handful of debtors who had been imprisoned unfairly due to corrupt officials. The move wasn't purely altruistic. He confiscated the corrupt officials' holdings and fined them, funneling the gold into the city's coffers. But the pardon earned him cheers in the streets, and that was worth something. Yet even as goodwill grew among many, the undercurrent of rebellion persisted. Rudge, the master of whispers, reported sporadic sightings of men wearing small pins shaped like a crowned stag or a three-headed dragon, depending on which rumor they favored. Some might simply be criminals exploiting the legend, but others were serious. In one chilling report, a band of masked riders torched a crown tax caravan in the Crownlands, leaving a scrap of parchment pinned to a burned wagon that read, "False king, your time will end in fire and blood." Below it was an amateurish sketch of a dragon's skull. Bronn's rage was tempered by a cold, methodical clarity. He called the small council at once, demanding a full breakdown of what they knew. They spent hours poring over leads, each more tenuous than the last. Could an exiled Targaryen line truly exist across the sea, waiting for the right moment to strike? Could a Baratheon bastard, grown powerful in Essos, plan to reclaim his father's throne? Or was this some elaborate deception by a disgruntled house within Westeros, using the old sigils as camouflage? No one could say for certain, but the persistent nature of these hints alarmed them all. Bronn drummed his fingers on the table, trying to contain his impatience. "Fine," he said. "We'll tighten the net, increase the watch on the docks, double the pay for informants in the Crownlands, pull in ships from the royal fleet to patrol the gullet. If some sell-sail is sneaking a pretender in, I want them caught." One counselor hesitated. "Your Grace, that will be expensive. We'd have to reallocate coin earmarked for the Winter Relief Fund and the new road expansions." Bronn cut him off. "Do it. Roads won't matter if we're fighting another war in the streets of King's Landing. As for the winter relief, well, maybe the North can manage with fewer shipments until we know the realm is secure." Inez frowned at that. We negotiated in good faith with the North. If we renege so quickly, it might push them away. Perhaps we can find funds elsewhere? The Vale or... We'll look, Bronn said, forcing a calmer tone. He didn't want to clash openly with his wife in front of the council. If it can't be found, we shift priorities. Security first. She nodded, though her gaze told him she hoped the cost wouldn't be too high in terms of alliances. Regardless, the edict was issued. More coin would be spent on intelligence and naval patrols. Work crews in certain regions slowed, and talk of new roads quieted. Some discontented murmurs circulated among the realm's lords, but none loud enough to challenge Bronn outright. Most recognized that the threat of a renewed rebellion or a foreign-backed claimant could destabilize everyone's holdings. Winter's onset brought chill winds to King's Landing. While it was nothing compared to the North's harsh climate, the nights grew cold, and the days were often gray and damp. Fires roared in the Red Keep's hearths, though in some corners, servants grumbled about rationing wood to ensure the capital had enough for the season. The city's population, swelled by migrants hoping for work, felt the pinch. Bread prices rose, leading to occasional brawls in marketplaces. Bronn authorized the city watch to keep a tighter grip on the streets, hoping to prevent petty crimes from exploding into rioting. All the while, Inez worked behind the scenes, writing letters to lords who were known for their moderate stances, reminding them of the crown's mission to keep the peace. She also corresponded with influential merchants, encouraging them to help stabilize prices in exchange for certain future benefits. It was a delicate dance. Some courtiers accused her of meddling, while others admired her proactive approach. Bronn watched with a grudging respect. He was never one for complicated negotiations if a swift threat could do the job, but he saw the sense in ensuring that not every problem was solved by pointing a sword at it. One afternoon, as heavy clouds threatened rain, a hooded figure arrived at the Red Keep, demanding to speak with the king. The guards nearly turned him away, but he produced a sealed token used by the Master of Whispers, indicating he was a contact of some importance. Startled, the guards escorted him inside. Rudge was summoned, and Bronn joined them in a small antechamber. The figure pulled back his hood. He was a gaunt man with scars across his cheek and a missing ear, which gave him a lopsided appearance. He introduced himself only as Koss, a smuggler from the Stepstones. In hushed tones, he claimed knowledge of a conspiracy, a group operating on a remote island in the Stepstones, rumored to be training men-at-arms and forging alliances with pirates. Their leader was said to be a silver-haired youth of Valyrian features, calling himself Aelor Targaryen. Bronn folded his arms, leaning against the wall. "You're certain of this?" Koss nodded, fear in his eyes. "I saw him with my own eyes. He's got those purple eyes, or maybe lilac. People there are calling him the Flame Reborn. He's gathering sellswords, promising them wealth when he reclaims his birthright." "And you're telling me this why?" Bronn asked skeptically. "If you're part of it, why not keep quiet?" Koss swallowed. "I was just a smuggler bringing them supplies. Didn't realize what it was about until I saw the men training, the talk of invasion. I want no part in a war. Figured I'd sell the information to the crown for a good price. If you want details, names, routes, I can provide them." Rudge looked to Bronn, who gazed at Koss with that calculating stare. "All right," the king said at last. "You'll get your price, but only once we verify your intel. If you're lying, you'll be wishing for a quick death." Koss shuddered, nodding vigorously. "Understood." Bronn instructed Rudge to gather everything Koss knew, cross-reference it with existing rumors, and prepare a covert mission to the Stepstones. If there truly was a Targaryen pretender massing forces, better to strike at them early. "No big fleet," Bronn warned. "We don't want to spook them into scattering. Send a handful of my best knights, maybe some sell-sails who know the area." Quietly, after Koss was led away, Rudge's expression was grave. "If this is genuine, it could be the largest threat we've faced since you took the throne, Your Grace." Bronn's jaw tightened. "We've dealt with threats before. Dragons or no dragons, if he tries to sail an army into Westeros, we'll meet him with steel. But let's see if there's any truth to these claims first. Word of the alleged Targaryen in the Stepstones did not remain secret for long. Whispers spread among the court, then seeped into the city. Soon, everyone was talking of Aelor Targaryen, though accounts varied wildly. Some said he was a dragon rider who had found a hidden egg that hatched for him alone. Others claimed he was a bastard with only faint Valyrian blood who dyed his hair silver. The uncertainty only fueled the legend. Bronn realized how quickly such a rumor could ignite the imaginations of discontented lords and commoners alike. Targaryens still held a mythic allure. They had once conquered the entire continent with dragons. People were drawn to that legacy of fire and power. Inez found Bronn in his solar one night, poring over maps of the Narrow Sea and the Stepstones. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You seem troubled." He set the map aside. "Troubled? No. Angry? Yes. We've barely solidified peace, and now some upstart tries to claim the Targaryen mantle." She sat beside him, scanning the lines of the map. If he truly has enough men, or if he gains more supporters within Westeros, we could be looking at another war. Dragons or not, the Targaryen name carries weight. "A war I don't want, but a war I'll fight if it comes to it," Bronn muttered. "I'll not stand by and let a pretender carve the realm into chaos again." They talked strategy, or as much as they could with the limited intelligence they had. Inez advocated sending an envoy to the Stepstones, perhaps to buy off or sow discord among the pirates. Bronn was more inclined to strike first, quietly, and cut off the head of the rebellion before it could sprout alliances in Westeros. "No sense negotiating with a phantom," he grumbled. "If the man truly is a Targaryen, he'll never yield his claim. If he's a fraud, he's still dangerous if people believe him." Inez touched his hand. "Then we root him out. But let's be certain of what we're dealing with. People in the city are already whispering about dragons returning. You know how quickly fear and hope can spread." He nodded. "Aye, we keep this quiet for now. I've got Rudge-picking men for a recon mission. Once they confirm how large this threat is, we'll act." In the following weeks, the infiltration force departed King's Landing under secrecy, disguised as merchant seamen heading for trade in Lys. Meanwhile, the realm carried on, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing across the Narrow Sea. As winter deepened, the chill made street life in the capital more austere. Beggars crowded by the gatehouse, seeking warmth and food. Bronn ordered some distribution of bread to prevent unrest, while still keeping an eye on the treasury. The Master of Coin mentioned that the realm's finances, though still robust, were beginning to tighten under the increased security measures and the reduced tolls in certain regions. Bronn weighed the cost of raising taxes again, but decided it was too risky. Better to keep the commoners content than push them into the arms of any rebellious cause. Inez continued her diplomatic efforts. She hosted small dinners for select lords and ladies, forging personal connections that could prove invaluable if war broke out. She also cultivated ties with foreign envoys from Bravos and Pentos, encouraging them to remain neutral, and reminding them that the crown was a more stable and profitable partner than any upstart Targaryen could be. Occasionally, Bronn joined these gatherings, though such soirees bored him. He'd rather be in the training yard or checking the city's defenses. But he understood that part of ruling involved letting others see him in a civilized setting, sipping wine and exchanging pleasantries. The courtiers noted the king's rough edges had softened slightly. He wore finer garments than in his early reign, though he still eschewed excessive ornamentation. He rarely used flowery language, but he'd learned how to make polite conversation when absolutely necessary. Within the Red Keep, rumors abounded about whether the king and queen were trying for an heir. Servants gossiped about potions or tonics that Inez might be taking. Neither Bronn nor Inez addressed the rumors publicly. Privately, they'd discuss children. He was hesitant, recalling how children could become pawns or threats in the deadly politics of Westeros. She acknowledged the risk but pointed out that a stable succession might dissuade some rebels. The matter remained unresolved, an undercurrent in their lives that neither pressed too hard. Yet, then, one frigid morning, a crow arrived bearing a coded message from the infiltration force in the Stepstones. Rudge decoded it with trembling fingers, then brought the message straight to the king's solar. Inez was there, poring over a letter from the Vale. Bronn took the slip of parchment, scanning it quickly. A scowl etched itself across his face. "They've confirmed an armed camp," he said, reading aloud. "There's a fortress on a small island, once an old pirate stronghold, where men loyal to this Aelor Targaryen are training. They've got at least 300 sellswords, and more rumored to be coming. No dragon sighted, but the lad does have Valyrian features." He clenched his fist around the parchment. "And they've started forging an emblem, a black banner with a dragon skull in silver, calling themselves the Sons of the Dragon. Bloody dramatic. They might attempt a landing come spring." Inez exhaled slowly. 300 isn't an army that can topple the 7 kingdoms. But if they land in a sympathetic region and gather local support. Bronn's face hardened. "We can't let them land." "Rudge, you have more details." The spymaster nodded. "They mention that the fort's defenses are not complete. The cove can only handle smaller ships at a time. A quick strike by sea might overwhelm them before they finish building a proper harbor or ramparts." Bronn looked to Inez. "We've got time. The seas are rough in winter, especially around the stepstones. They might wait for calmer weather. If we strike soon, we risk storms, but it might catch them unprepared. If we wait until spring, they might be stronger." She mulled it over. "A winter naval campaign is risky, but it's also unexpected. If we muster enough ships, fast galleys that can navigate tricky waters, we could surprise them. Destroy the fortress, capture or kill this Aelor Targaryen before he sets foot in Westeros." Rudge added, "We'd need absolute secrecy. A large fleet might draw notice from spies in the city, but a smaller force might not be enough to guarantee success." Bronn nodded grimly. "We'll send a moderate force, enough to do the job, but not so big that we can't keep it under wraps. Handpick the captains, men we trust. We strike fast, strike hard. If the lad is there, we bring him back in chains or put a sword through him." Inez studied Bronn's expression. "I'd advise capturing him if possible. A public trial showing he's a fraud might dispel the legend. If you just kill him, some will call him a martyr." Bronn's lip curled. "Fine. I won't go out of my way to kill him if he surrenders. But I'm not risking our men's lives to keep him breathing if he resists. Either way, we end this. I won't have another war over some dragon banner." The plan came together swiftly. Under the guise of routine patrols, a fleet of 9 ships, 6 war galleys and 3 smaller support vessels, quietly assembled off the coast near Crackclaw Point. Each carried a complement of experienced marines and archers, many of whom had proven their loyalty in past campaigns. The official story was that they were patrolling for pirates in the Narrow Sea. Bronn personally chose a seasoned knight, Ser Osmond Grey, to command the expedition. Ser Osmond was known for his discretion and ruthlessness. As the ships weighed anchor on a stormy evening, Bronn and Inez stood on the Red Keep's ramparts, watching the distant lanterns vanish into the night. The wind whipped at their cloaks, and icy rain stung their faces. "I should go," Bronn muttered half to himself. "I'm not a man who likes sitting behind walls while others fight." Inez put a hand on his arm. "You're the king. The realm needs stability here, especially if this Targaryen is a decoy for something else. Your place is in King's Landing for now." He bowed his head slightly, acknowledging the truth. The days when he could ride off to every skirmish were gone. The throne demanded continuity. If he were lost at sea or killed in a raid, chaos would follow. It rankled him, but he'd grown enough as a ruler to accept necessity. They descended the ramparts and made their way inside, the cold seeping into their bones. Over the next weeks, tension gripped the court. There was no immediate word from Ser Osmond's fleet. The winter storms battered the coastline, and more than one messenger raven was lost. All Bronn could do was wait, feigning calm in public while privately cursing the weather and the unknown. Inez continued her tasks, ensuring day-to-day governance didn't falter, but behind her composed demeanor, she too wrestled with worry. Finally, in the deep hush of a snowy dawn, a raven arrived with the royal seal from Ser Osmond. The message was sparse. Landed under cover of darkness. Storm fierce. Lost 1 galley. Garrison at fortress bigger than expected. Near 500 men. We attacked at first light. Heavy fighting. Many casualties. The youth calling himself Aelor is not here. Some say he sailed to Lys days ago. We destroyed stores. Burned the half-built harbor. Some defenders fled inland. Enemy scattered, but we did not capture the pretender. We'll search local waters. Bronn read the dispatch with a clenched jaw. So the main base was smashed, but the prize had escaped. A sense of frustration gnawed at him. This was better than letting the rebellion grow, but not the decisive blow he'd wanted. If Aelor Targaryen, or whoever he was, had slipped away, then the threat remained. He passed the note to Inez, who pursed her lips. At least the fortress is gone. It will hamper his ability to launch a direct invasion anytime soon. But if he's in Lys, he can regroup. Damn it, Bronn said quietly. We'll have to keep chasing him across Essos if we want him gone for good. That could be costly. And if he's clever, he'll vanish whenever we get close. Over the next few days, more ravens arrived with details of the battle. The Crown's forces had fought fiercely, setting fires that consumed much of the stronghold. Some of the rebels had been captured, others killed. But none of the captives knew exactly where Aelor had gone, only that he'd boarded a swift ship bound for Lys with a handful of loyal companions. Ser Osmond's men scoured nearby islands, but found no trace. Bronn met with his council in a grim session. We can't let him gather fresh forces in Essos. We either intercept him or we face the same threat later. I say we put a price on his head. A big one. The master of coin hesitated. A bounty that large might drain our reserves. Bronn cut him off. Better a dent in our coffers than a war that drains it entirely. Post the bounty in every port from Bravos to Volantis. 1,000 gold dragons for his capture alive. 500 for his head if he's proven to be the same man. That'll make every sellsword in the free cities hunt him. Inez nodded. And we should also intensify our diplomacy. Warn the rulers of Lys, Tyrosh, Pentos. If they harbor him, they become enemies of the crown. Some will bristle, but some might be persuaded to deny him safe harbor rather than risk conflict with Westeros. The plan went forward. Over the next moon's turn, criers in every major Essosi port announced the bounty. Envoys from the crown visited magisters and princes, reminding them that trade with Westeros was lucrative, and aiding a pretender would be most unwise. For a time, it seemed to work. Reports trickled in of sightings in Lys. Someone matching Aelor's description had been hustled out of the city by local authorities, eager not to anger the Iron Throne. Then another rumor placed him in Volantis, but by the time sellswords arrived to claim the bounty, he was gone. Back in King's Landing, the winter months grew bitterly cold. Frost clung to the city's rooftops, and the Blackwater occasionally had chunks of ice drifting downstream. The small folk huddled around fires, cursing the shortened supply of grain and the rising cost of bread. Bronn distributed just enough relief to prevent large-scale unrest, while quietly ramping up the city watch's presence. He was determined that no rebel spark would ignite within the city walls. One evening, Inez surprised Bronn with news that warmed his spirits more than any mulled wine could. She was with child. She told him in a quiet moment, away from the eyes of the court, her voice tinged with both excitement and wariness. He blinked, processing the information. "Are you certain?" "The maester confirmed it," she said. "I felt the signs, too. It's still early, of course, and we must be cautious. But, yes, I'm with child." Bronn felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Joy was there, certainly, he was no heartless brute, but also a flicker of anxiety. A child would be a blessing to secure the succession, to silence some of the whispers that a sellsword king couldn't found a lasting dynasty. Yet it also meant a new vulnerability. Rebels might seek to harm the child, or use the child as a rallying point if they tried to cast doubt on Bronn's legitimacy. He pulled Inez close, resting a calloused hand gently on her stomach. "That's good," he said, fumbling for words. "Better than good." She saw the flicker of concern in his eyes. "We'll protect our child," she whispered. "This is our realm now, our family. No one will tear it apart." He nodded, letting her reassurance wash over him. A child. Another life in the Red Keep. A potential heir who would unite Dorne and the crown, and perhaps defuse some of the ambition that fueled pretenders like Aelor Targaryen. The realm, Bronn realized, would now watch this pregnancy as a sign of the monarchy's stability, or lack thereof. A fortnight later, the news of the queen's pregnancy broke at court. Celebrations erupted, orchestrated by various lords eager to show their support. Gifts poured in, from silver baby rattles to elaborate cradles carved with heraldic designs. The small folk cheered when the announcement was made from the steps of the Great September. Some cynics whispered that the child might not even be Bronn's, or that it was all a ruse, but these murmurs were overshadowed by the widespread relief that a direct line of succession might be established at last. Meanwhile, letters of congratulations arrived from across Westeros. The North sent their usual curt note, congratulating the king and queen. The Westerlands and the Reach offered more flowery messages. Even Dorne penned a heartfelt missive, reaffirming the bond between the Martells and the crown. But the greatest surprise came from overseas. The Magister of Pentos wrote that a certain fugitive known as Aelor Targaryen had been detained briefly, then vanished under suspicious circumstances. It seemed the city's jailers had been bribed, or perhaps threatened, to release him, and no one knew where he'd gone next. The Magister expressed regret at the slip, congratulating the crown on the impending birth and promising that Pentos harbored no ill will. Bronn read this letter with a deepening scowl. Inez, noticing his agitation, gently pried the parchment from his hand. "He's slippery, this Aelor," she murmured. "But with the entire continent of Essos to hide in, it might be impossible to catch him. Perhaps time will handle this. The bounty stands, and with each day, his cause may fade if he can't launch a tangible threat." Bronn shook his head. "Possibly, but men love a romantic story, especially if it's about a dragon prince in exile. If he resurfaces in a year or two with enough gold or mercenaries, we'll be dealing with this all over again." Despite the frustration, he recognized that at least for the moment, Aelor posed no active threat on Westeros' soil. The fortress in the Stepstones was gone, and winter storms made any major crossing difficult. The best course might be to wait him out while keeping the realm stable. So Bronn threw himself into reinforcing alliances, building the navy, and preparing for the birth of his child, an event that increasingly occupied Inez's thoughts. As the months passed, the queen's belly grew round, and the Red Keep buzzed with anticipation. Winter's chill still gripped the land, but courtiers spoke of new beginnings. Bronn, less sentimental, focused on ensuring that no threat emerged to exploit the situation. The city watch was increased around the keep, and spies watched for any sign of infiltration. He even convened a special guard to protect Inez personally, a mix of Dornish and Westerosi warriors who answered directly to him. Across the sea, rumors of Aelor Targaryen flared and fizzled. One day, a traveler claimed he'd seen the silver-haired youth riding with a band of Sellswords near Myr. The next day, another claimed he'd been poisoned in Volantis. None of these stories could be verified. Sometimes Bronn wondered if half the rumors were fabricated by old rivals or opportunists just to stir the pot. Rudge assured the king that none of his contacts had seen credible evidence of an actual army forming, so perhaps Aelor's ambitions were thwarted for now. Finally, on a raw, windy night in late winter, Inez went into labor. The castle maesters and midwives rushed to her chambers, lighting braziers for warmth and preparing the tools of their trade. Bronn paced in the corridor, half sick with worry. He remembered hearing that childbirth was often the battlefield for women, and many queens and ladies had died bringing forth heirs. Inez was strong, he told himself, Dornish and determined. She would pull through. But as the hours dragged on, and her cries of pain echoed beyond the closed door, he felt powerless in a way he had never known on any battlefield. At last, just before dawn, the crying of a newborn rang through the halls. A moment later, the door swung open, and a sweating midwife emerged with a broad smile. "A girl, Your Grace." The The queen is well, though exhausted. You have a healthy daughter. Relief washed over him. He stepped inside, saw Inez propped against a mountain of pillows, damp hair clinging to her brow, but smiling faintly. In her arms was a small, wrinkled figure with a shock of dark hair, already a testament to Bronn's own black locks, though the shape of the infant's face hinted at Martell features. Gently, he took the tiny bundle, feeling an odd tightness in his chest. He had never thought he would have children, certainly not as king. The baby let out a soft whimper, then quieted as he cradled her. "She's perfect," he murmured, marveling that his calloused hands could hold something so fragile. Inez reached out to stroke the baby's cheek. "We should name her something that suits both our traditions. Perhaps Eliana or Nymeria, after the Dornish warrior queen? Or—" he glanced at her, half smiling. "Nymeria, That's got a certain ring to it. A proud name." She smiled back. "Yes, Nymeria." And so it was decided. Princess Nymeria of the Crown. By midday, word spread through King's Landing that the child was born. The queen was safe, and the king was now father to a strong little girl. Bells rang from the great September. Crowds gathered in the streets cheering, and lords and ladies lined up to offer congratulations or gifts. The small folk, ever starved for hopeful news in a cold winter, embraced the birth as a sign that perhaps the realm had turned a corner into a more prosperous age. Bronn, exhausted by the long night and the sudden rush of well-wishers, finally managed to slip away to a quiet terrace that overlooked the city. Snowflakes drifted through the gray sky, settling on the battlements. He stood there, letting the cold air clear his head. Inez was resting, the baby swaddled beside her, under the vigilant eye of the maester. For a man who once only cared about coin, comfort, and staying alive, he found himself unexpectedly bound by deeper ties. A wife he respected and a daughter he wanted to protect above all else. He gazed over King's Landing, the sprawl of buildings blanketed by a thin layer of white. The realm was calmer than it had been in years, though the shadow of Aelor Targaryen still loomed somewhere across the sea. Old grudges still simmered in places like the Iron Islands or the rebellious fringes of the Crownlands. And new challenges would arise, as they always did in Westeros. But for this moment, on this snowy morning, Bronn allowed himself a brief sense of triumph. He had weathered countless storms, outlived foes and doubters, forged a realm that, if not adoring him, at least functioned under his rule. He had a child now, a piece of himself and Inez who might someday sit on the Iron Throne, if the fates allowed. A smirk tugged at his lips. The Sellsword who became king, now father to a princess named after a legendary Dornish queen. Life was a series of improbable turns, and he had learned to ride each twist with a mixture of cunning and luck. As the wind whipped past, carrying the distant roar of the city's celebrations, he decided that, despite all the burdens of the crown, he would not trade places with any man in Westeros. He turned and strode back inside, eager to return to the queen and their newborn daughter. Let the realm do what it would. Bronn had faced everything from duels on moonlit cliffs to the politics of the Red Keep. He'd face whatever came next, too, so long as he had steel in his hand, wit in his mind, and a family worth protecting. The Game of Thrones continued, always. But for now, King Bronn intended to savor his hard-won joys before the next storm broke.